Okay, in the last class we saw the quarrel between the spirituals and the community and how the spirituals came to a very sad ending. However, the spiritual demise did not end the controversy from within the order. The two camps continued, although the group being led by Angelo Clareno, Peter Gianolivi, and Robertino de Casale, even though this group came to its conclusion with a very terrible ending of 362 being imprisoned, 5 being burnt at the stake, and then Gianolivi's group continuing, Clareno's group continuing on and falling in out of favor with the church over the years. The desire to live the original rule as St. Francis gave it, the desire to live it according to the Testament, the desire to be faithful to the charism without the privileges and exemptions given by the Holy Fathers and demanded by those who wanted relaxations to live more of a contemporary life of comfort and so forth. That the spiritual thirst continued, that thirst to live the literal interpretation of the rule, as it does to this day among some friars. Okay, so now we have two groups that have developed. We now have a new battle. Before we had the spirituals versus the community, and now we have what's going to be known as the Observants versus the Conventuals. The community is now being called the Conventuali. We talked about how that got its name from that papal bull that talked about the conventual friaries that were large enough to hold a chapter, that were centers and so forth of study, and they got that name conventual, living that big liturgies, the big masses, whatever, the big houses. And versus the Observants. They're no longer being called the spirituals or the zelanti, the zealots. Now they're going to call themselves the Observants, those who want to observe the rule. And so they get the name the Observants. Okay? So these are the two camps. They become known as the Observants, those who believed in return to the pristine observance of the rule. They loved the remote hermitage friaries, private prayer, austerity, poverty, simplicity in buildings, and simplicity in liturgical celebrations. Let me go over that list again. We're talking about the Observant Reform. We're talking about those who are clinging to these basic principles. The remote hermitage friaries, those small friaries of 12 guys living outside the city. Private prayer, a lot of time given over to quiet personal prayer. Austerity of life, in both food and clothing and shelter. Poverty, not ownership of buildings and no use of money and so forth. Simple use of things, so simplicity in buildings, and simplicity in liturgical celebrations. Simple, quiet, more of an interior, deeper, contemplative expression of the life. Then we have the Conventuals, the second group, as we mentioned, and these were those who dwelt in spacious buildings, where the solemn order or rhythm of communal living, conventual living, was of prominent importance. They were well suited with legal mitigations in accordance with which they had taken their vows. They disliked innovation and spontaneous raptures, spontaneous prayer. They trusted in the dependability of monastic discipline to help remain faithful to the ideal and give good service to the church. So they were more monastic leaning than they were Franciscan leaning, particularly in the way they observed poverty and observed liturgy. So the conventual life really went down a path where it was more monastic than it was mendicant. In self-sufficiency, ownership, use of money, liturgical fanfare, and so forth. So the order's relationship with Pope John the 22nd, 1321 to 1334, he was Pope. It was 13 years. So the condemnation of Narbonne. A statement was made by Beguin about the poverty of Christ and the apostles. He said they possessed nothing either communally or privately. The friars appealed against the Dominican inquisitor. So the Pope stepped in and claimed that the friars' position was absurd. He declared the Holy See no longer owned the property of the friars. So Beguin, who was a friar, puts out this statement that Christ was completely poor, the friars they had nothing, communally or privately, and it kind of caused some controversy with the Dominican inquisitor. The Pope said, this is ridiculous. You guys now own your own stuff, your own houses, your own money. We don't own any of it. And then he banned the appointment of trustees and syndicates to act on the Pope's behalf. In other words, it's all yours now. Let's stop the game playing. And so the Holy Father responded to the Franciscans by saying, I'm just tired of this foolishness. So in 1322, there was a general chapter in Perugia, and the friars circulated a letter that Beguin's statement was not heretical, which prompted a response by the Holy Father, John the 22nd, December 8th, 1322, ad conditorem. Ad, A-D, conditorem, C-O-N-D-I-T-O-R-E-M. Papal bull ad conditorem, John the 22nd, December 8th, 1322. This was given in response to the general chapter's letter. The essence of the gospel is charity, he said. Renunciation of worldly goods is a way to follow charity, and that there's no longer distinction between usus facti and usus juris. The friars owned it all. No more legal fictions. So Pope was basically saying, listen, no more of these legal fictions. If you're going to own property, own your property. Okay? You're going to live in poverty, well, then live in poverty. But we're not going to longer pretend like we own all the stuff that you have and you just have use of it. Because you have way too much and here you are claiming poverty. And so, we're no longer playing that game. So the Holy Father pulled back and he canceled out all previous papal bulls on the subject of ownership. He followed with another papal bull on November 23rd, 1223. I apologize, I don't have the name there. November 23rd, 1223, and declared that the statement about Christ and the apostles' poverty to be heretical. Now, the Minister General, Michael of Cesena, C-E-S-E-N-A, Michael of Cesena. He was Minister General from 1316 to 1328, so 12 years. Michael of Cesena, 1316 to 1328. He tried to persuade the Holy Father to concede the poverty of the apostles in Christ. And he asked the former Minister General, Bonagrazia, to speak to the Pope. Michael wound up being excommunicated. That's how serious the Pope was taking it. The Pope was not going to play the game. In 1324, King Louis of Bavaria engaged in a struggle with the Pope and proceeded to take the order under his protection. So now the kings are getting involved because he's having a dispute with the Pope. So the Pope retaliated, and he ordered all the universities to teach that Christ and the apostles had ownership of money. I mean, this is getting a little ridiculous, isn't it? So Michael of Cesena was ordered to Avignon, where the Holy Father was residing at the time, where he entered into a confrontation with the Pope. The Holy Father called for the order to call a general chapter in order to elect a new Minister General. In 1328, the general chapter in Bologna re-elected Michael of Cesena. Okay, now they're playing politics with the Holy Father. The emperor had the Franciscan Peter de Corbaro elected an anti-pope in the middle of all of this. And he took the name Pope Nicholas V, the anti-pope Nicholas V. So now we have an anti-pope and a pope, right? So John excommunicates Michael and all the other leaders, placing Bertrand de la Tour in 1332 in charge. He died in 1332. He placed Bertrand of the Tour in charge of the order as vicar general. It's getting crazy. In 1339, the general chapter happened in Paris. And Gerard Eudes, E-U-D-E-S, John Eudes, a friend of the Pope, was elected Minister General. And he was Minister General from 1339 to 1342. 1339 to 1342. And he had little sympathy for the Franciscan ideal, more of the conventual friar, Gerard Eudes. And he abolished the ban on taking money. So he basically just abrogated the rule and said, oh, we can take money, no problem. And he gave each provincial power to grant exemption from the rule, not only from constitutions or from precepts or whatever, from this or that, but he's from the rule itself that Francis wrote, that the provincial can exempt from the rule. Caused a great decline in the order. The church's schism ended with the resignation of the anti-pope, thanks be to God. Michael of Cesena, Bonagrazia, and William of Ockham were reconciled with the church before death and surrendered the seals of the order to the new Minister General. So what caused this decline in the order? Well, first of all, bad publicity. This fighting with the Pope really was, and then the Emperor's taking side just caused people to go like, shh, this is ridiculous. I'm not entering that order. The Hundred Years' War also affected it. The Hundred Years' War went from 1339 to 1453. So that greatly affected the order. But also the Black Death. The Black Death from 1348 to 1350, the 2 years where the order lost 2/3 of its members in the Black Death. I mean, it was horrendous what took place throughout the world, but 2/3 of the friars. And mostly because the friars were attending to the sick. They were attending to those that's how they got sick. So low numbers forced them to abandon the hermitage friaries and regroup in large city friaries. So between the bad publicity, the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, the number decreases to 2/3 of its size. And so they had abandoned the smaller friaries and they moved into the larger friaries in the cities. And you had all these older friaries sitting out there. These are some dating back to the time of Francis that no one was living in anymore. And until the friars started grouping together in the larger cities because there were so few friars left after the incredible publicity, the 100 Years' War, and the Black Death. Okay, and later the cause was the Great Schism that happened. Who was the true pope? To whom will he be faithful? Will he be faithful to the pope or the anti-pope? So a general decay of medieval values is also taking place at this time. So we have the decline of the Middle Ages in the mid-14th century. So this was a problem. Okay. Now the new pope, Pope Benedict XII, was a Cistercian, and he gave the friars a monastic type of constitutions. So now the constitutions are changing. You have the rule of Francis, but now the constitutions of Narbonne that they've been following over these years, for the most part, with more exemptions and more privileges, was trumped by a Cistercian form of constitutions. And notice how it's no longer being focused on living the rule. Now we're changing to focusing constitutions as opposed to the rule that Francis gave. And remember what I said about constitutions. The purpose of constitutions was to assist in the living of the rule. And now it's changing where constitutions are being used to mitigate the rule, to live, not what the rule has said. Okay. So in this new Cistercian constitutions given by the new Pope Benedict XII, it gave priority to the sung office. It enforced study, enforced silence, enforced enclosure, and basically confirmed the conventual discipline. It introduced total abstinence from meat, something Francis himself never banned. Poverty and money were not even mentioned, and with all the exemptions given already, it wasn't a big deal where they began to live a monastic form of poverty where the friars had, or the community owned it, but no one really personally owned it. It became a monastic form of poverty as opposed to a mendicant form of poverty where not only did individual friars have nothing, but the order had nothing. And these were promulgated by the General Chapter in 1337 in Cahors. Cahors, Cahors, Cahors. In 1354, the order was able to reinstate the constitutions of Narbonne. So thanks be to God. It took them a few years to get free. From 1337 to 1354, they were being guided by these Cistercian-style constitutions, which did have an effect on the order and making it more monastic, more conventual. So they instituted the new constitutions of Carbone with the amendments, and these are called the Statutes of Farinierina. I can't even say that word. Statutes of Farineriana. Farineriana. So Farinier was the Minister General, William Farinier. He was Minister General from 1348 to 1357. And he wrote the statutes, which is why they were named after him. Good luck trying to say the name. Farineriana, whatever. So they were written in 1354. And then in the church, we have the Great Schisms. These are all things that are affecting the life of the order, right? So, the church, just as the order seems to be recovering from the Black Death, in the middle of the 100 Years' War, that falling out with the Holy Father, so the bad press, they're given these constitutions, they finally get free of those constitutions, and then the Great Schism happens. And the Great Schism takes place between 1378 and 1418. So the order had many minister generals as the church had popes. The church was first divided into 2 and then 3 in the year 1409. So even provinces had 2 provincials, each obeying a different pope. Even still, the prestige of the order did remain high, although they had this, bad rep. They kind of recovered from the bad rep, and then because they were serving the poor and the plague victims, it kind of helped them a bit in their popularity. But there was such confusion in the church, and then the confusion in the order, which provincial was loyal to which pope, which general was loyal to each pope, and it was just confusion all over the place. We have to really read church history to understand what was going on in the church, but needless to say, everything that happened in the church greatly affected the life of the friars. It happened that the third pope that got elected during this time was another Franciscan, Peter of Candia, Candia, Peter of Candia. He was elected at Pisa in 1409, and he took the name Pope Alexander V, or the anti-Pope Alexander V. So, at the Council of Constance, which ended the schism, 36 friars took part in that council, which ended the schism in 1418. The council proclaimed the Minister General Anthony of Pietro as the true Minister General of the order, and he was Minister General from 1405 to 1421. And that's Anthony of Pietro. So, there was a calmness in this. Okay, we have this one pope now, the schism's over. Now we have one Minister General, Anthony of Pietro. Okay? And he had been traveling through Europe since 1407 trying to end the schism. So Anthony of Pietro was a good guy trying to end the schism. And finally, the chapter got together and said, okay, there is one Minister General, and it's Anthony. Okay? In 1418, the general chapter in Mantua reunited the order. So the order was just as divided. Half the order following this, with this general following this pope, this section of the order following this general with this pope. Basta così. In 1418, the general chapter of Mantua reunited it, and everybody had one minister general, one provincial per province, and there was one pope. What happens in the church affects the life of the order. Does this all make sense? I know there's a lot of confusion here, but there was a lot of confusion in the church. So if you're confused, you got to think with the mind of the church. All right. Yeah, right. So the observants. So during the pontificate of John the 22nd, we're going to shoot back some years, okay? We're going to shoot back from 1418 back to 1334. So during the pontificate of John the 22nd, there was a resurgence of a desire to live total observance of the rule. So it issued back up again just a few years after the condemnation of the spirituals. It just resurfaced once again. And so in 1334, Brother John of Valle, Valle, John of Valle, he received permission to go into a hermitage with 4 companions to observe the rule without papal definition. So John of Valle, he's taking the obedience with permission. He and 4 others, so 5 of them, go to live in one of the abandoned friaries. Okay, and it's an Umbrian hermitage of Brogliamo, Brogliamo, Brogliamo. And this caused a return to the hermitage friaries. This inspired others to do the same. So 1334, John of Valle and 5 others go to one hermitage. And then in 1350, Brother Gentile of Spoleto, he obtained a papal bull by Pope Clement VI, authorizing certain friars from hermitage communities to live the rule to the letter. So now they're getting papal bulls protecting them as opposed to papal bulls mitigating the rule. And so the brothers are being rather wise now, saying, hey, if they can get papal bulls for mitigation, I can get papal bulls for protection. And so Brother Gentile of Spoleto in 1350 goes to the new Pope Clement VI, gets permission and the authorization to live in the hermitage community to live the rule to the letter, without interference from the superiors, with the permission to receive novices. So now he has this hermitage friary that the superiors can't interrupt, because he has a papal bull saying they can't interrupt him living it, and he can receive novices and form them according to the rule of life. So instead of having guys enter the order, have to go through the conventual formation where they're trained to not observe poverty, trained not to observe the earthly way of life and the austerities and the penances of the order, and then have to try to somehow bring them out of it, he's allowed to bring them right into the living of the early life and the primitive inspiration of the life, to live the charism the way Francis taught it. So he's got that permission to do that, and the superiors can't interfere. He's got a papal bull saying that he's allowed to live the charism which he professed. Okay. In 1349, the Minister General, William Ferry Neyer, as you already mentioned, he wrote that new constitutions a few years after this. So 1349, Ferry Neyer, we'll just call him William, sent out a circular letter warning friars against 3 errors into which reformers might fall. 3 errors. Adopting a particular kind of habit. Now, this is interesting. That it sounds like nothing to anybody else, but for the Franciscans, the habit was very important. And in 1313, so 36 years prior to this, the habit had changed. It went from being the one-piece habit with the long pointed hood to a 2-piece habit, the tunic without a hood, and then the capuch over the shoulders that went down around the back and kind of folded over, came across here and went to like kind of a circular thing in the back. What we see is the conventual habit today. The conventual habit is not the original habit. The Capuchin habit is the original habit of the order, which the Capuchins returned to. It was in 1313, which was, 90 years after Francis's death, that they changed the habit to the conventual style, being more of a Dominican model, you would say, without a scapular and still having the cord. That it was adopted. So there was a warning to try to go back to somehow a different type of habit. He also warned them against deviation from the Catholic faith. That's a good thing, which we saw with Joachimism. All right. And then the condemnation of the community. So he warned them against condemning the community. William declared that if anyone says that they cannot live the rule spiritually within the community, will be imprisoned. So there was that threat now. If you say you can't live the original rule and the original inspiration, as given by the Testament inside the big conventual friaries, you'll be imprisoned. So, put them on a little dangerous ground here, right? In 1354, the general chapter that approved the new constitutions of William Ferrier condemned Gentile's permissions. So Gentile, 4 years earlier, had that permission to live in the Hermitage Friary with the guys and had the papal bull to accept novices. That was condemned. He was condemned by the general chapter of friars. Gentile was accused of heresy and imprisoned by order of the papal legate. Really, was he a heretic? Another question here. Pope Innocent VI, the new pope, revoked Gentile's permissions. So that kind of blew out that reform that he was trying to bring about in the order. Was it real? Was he really a heretic? Or was this just more politicking going on? My guess is that people felt accused. He may not have been accusing people or accusing the community, but because he was living the radicality of the rule and saying that, look, it can be lived, that he was being falsely accused of heresy as a way of trying to shut him up and shut up the work he was doing. Sad to say, it does happen. Okay? So, there was the successful reform that came about by Brother Paul of Trinci. Blessed Paul of Trinci. Trinci, Trinci. Paul of Trinci. And the Zaccolanti. Zaccolanti. Zoccolanti. Zaccolanti. Another nickname. We'll get to that. Zaccolanti. So Brother Paul of Trinci was a lay brother and a member of Gentile's group. He was one of those guys living in the Hermitage with Gentile with the permission to live the radicality of the life. And he was taken under the protection of the Minister General, the new Minister General, Thomas Frignaro, who was Minister General from 1367 to 1372. 1367 to 1372, Thomas Frignaro. So Paul was taken into his care. So this is a good, 13 years after Gentile was condemned. Blessed Paul, repaired the Bregliano Hermitage and other deserted friaries. So in 1373, the reform had 12 friaries. And in 1374, were taken under the protection of the new Pope Gregory XI. So this is amazing. So this group begins, the lay brother who's living with Gentile, he's there in 1350. He's with him in in Spoleto living this reformed life. They're able to take novices. Maybe he was one of the novices accepted by Gentili. I'm not too sure. But anyway, 1354, Gentili is condemned. And then, Blessed Paul's a nice guy, Brother Paul, so he gets accepted by the order. He's given the same permissions. And all of a sudden, his reform just begins to flourish. And by 1373, he has 12 friaries. 1374, he's taken this little group is taken under the protection of the Pope, Gregory XI. And they obtained some friaries where the order would now live this radical life. They were given the Carcery. Now, the Carcery was an early friary, a hermitage friary built on the mountain next to Assisi. Okay? Then they obtained the friary at Fonte Colombo, which is where St. Francis wrote the rule. Then they obtained the friary in Greccio, which is where St. Francis had the first Christmas creche. And then Poggio Bostone, another early friary established by St. Francis. And then, because the Poor Clares moved out of San Damiano's and moved into their monastery next to the Basilica of St. Clare, in 1374, they obtained San Damiano's. And so now this reform group that was living the rule radically, founded by Blessed Paul of Trinci, was obtaining some of the most important places in the order. And, the conventual branch of the order really didn't care too much about these places because they were living in the big friars in the city. So these little hermitage friaries really had not much concern. They didn't have much concern about. And so they obtained the use of these friaries. They moved into them. And the provincials were beginning to oppose this because they saw this group who had the permission to receive novices and so forth and were forming guys according to this primitive form of the life, being in opposition to the conventual form of the life. And so the provincials began to oppose. But because Paul of Trinci had now the protection of the Holy Father, Pope Gregory XI, he was in good standing and he was doing okay. He had protection and he could continue on. So in 1380, Paul was given the office of commissary. In other words, he was now in charge of all reform groups within the order. So as these friars would pop up, where friars were living the early life, they were living according to St. Francis, according to the rule, using the Testament, the life and the words of St. Francis as their guide to live the life, and living in simplicity and in poverty and in prayer and so forth, contrary to the big, large friaries, the conventual style friaries. Paul had now control over these friaries. He had the authority to receive novices. He had the authority to found new houses wherever he wished. And even the minister general began to support him because they saw that what he was doing was very good for the order and good for the church. Okay. By the time of Paul's death in 1390, the reform had spread throughout all of Italy. The house was just growing. They had to wear wooden clogs in certain friaries because they couldn't get leather and because of the rough terrain. And they gave them the name that I mentioned earlier, the Zaccolanti, those who wear the clogs. They had to wear them these rough terrains. They couldn't go barefoot. And so they had to get these wooden clogs to get up and down the hills. And so I'm sure they didn't wear them all day. They just wore them up and down the roads. They're called the Zaccolanti, the guys with the clogs on, the nickname, the Zaccolanti. So came now the second generation of observants. So as Paul dies in 1390, the reform continues. The friars that have permission to live in these hermitage friaries throughout Italy, the reform is going on. There's a conventual kind of life going on, these big friaries and big liturgies and so forth, through a lot of apostolic ministry focusing on study. And then you have these smaller friaries where the friars were living according to the rule of St. Francis and according to the Testament and the life and words of Francis. So two coexisting. Paul dies in 1390, and all of a sudden now there's a resurgence of this next generation of guys who enter. And they are men of high caliber. So 12 years after the death of Paul, we have Bernardine of Siena, Saint Bernardine of Siena, enter the Reform. In 1414, we have the entrance of John of Capistrano. 1415, Blessed Albert of Sartiano enters the order. In 1416, we have St. James of the March enter the order. These four high caliber men of great preachers of austerity who can really lead the reform in a very powerful, strong way enter. These four men, with Bernardine at the head, will bring the reform to its peak. So they really are now going to bring this order to the reform to its stronghold. 1415, they're now known as the Observants, right? By this time, they're known as the Observants. The name was kind of sticking since Paul of Trinci began it in the 1370s, and it kind of stuck with them, actually back to Gentile in 1350. The name was being used, but now it was stuck, right? This is now the Observanti, the Observants. And they gained permission to settle at the Porziuncola. This was incredible. So now the friars living at the Porziuncola were now observant friars. The observant friars got control of what used to be the mother and head of the order. And again, the Conventuals, although it was where Francis lived and died, it wasn't important to them as the major Sacro Convento where Francis was buried, which had been declared as the caput and mater, the head and mother of the order. However, the observants, who wanted to be so close to Francis, cared more about how Francis lived than they wanted the Porziuncola. They wanted the place where he lived, where he died, that he loved so much that he told the friars to kick you out the front door, sneak in the back door, which was to be the model of all the friaries. Okay? And there was only one condition to them getting it, is that they had to give all income to the Sacro Convento, as if they were getting income. So in Spain, with the protection of the Avignon Pope, reforms sprung up independently of each other, but almost simultaneously. In 3 Iberian provinces, you had Santiago, Castile, and Aragon. You had a similar thing happening over there with these reform movements that were kicking up, outside of, unconnected to what was happening in Italy. In 1388, Brother Rodrigo Martinez obtained permission to go to a hermitage in Portugal, and again, initiate the life there. In 1392, Pope Boniface IX, the Roman Pope, allowed 3 religious to found another hermitage in the province of Santiago, so we have going on in Spain. In 1407, Benedict XIII, the Avignon Pope, gave permission for the building of 7 observant convents. In 1432, it increased to 11. And all was done with the permission of the Minister General. So the Minister General was allowing these reform movements to pick up and move on and continue to grow. It was actually having a very good effect for the rest of the order. But again, we also have this division that's being created between the conventual lifestyle and the observant lifestyle, right now presently under one head. Other countries and provinces and foundations. You have the Kingdom of Aragon in 1390 was the friaries of Manzanara and Chelva. 1403, you had Moraviedo in Valencia. And they were licensed to receive novices and also to receive the conventuals wanted to transfer over to them. 1413, in Segrob. These 4 hermitages were grouped by Pope Martin V in 1424. So you had it happen. Like the reform movement was fresh and it was on fire in Castile. In 1415, there were more than a dozen. Llerena in 1400, Villaverde in 1401, and so on. In 1417, Pope Benedict XIII appointed 2 visitors, having the function of major superior of reformed convents. So they're giving the reformed communities their own superiors. In 1416, the Canarian Islands, it began the reform movement. 1423, there were 4 houses. So within a few short years, 7 years, it went from 1 house to 4 houses. And that's where St. James of Alcala dedicated himself to God, right, in the Canary Islands. So you had these powerful men entering the order just exploding. They were free of the Joachimism, they were free of that heresy, and the order was kind of supporting this group. In France, you had in 1388, Touraine was an eremitical group, but apostolic and studious. 1402, in France, permission was given to build 2 houses for the spiritual observance. 1407, Pope Benedict VIII gave them their autonomy from the conventuals and even their own vicar general. So, I mean, you had a lot happening everywhere with this beautiful moment of reform within the order, this beautiful flourishing, finally allowing the rule of St. Francis to come out and be directed by the Testament, the life of St. Francis, and directed by the writings, particularly the admonitions of Francis. So provincials of each of the provinces were to make the reformed communities suffer. Although the Minister General was supportive and there was some support from other friars, there were in fact provincials who were the conventuals, did not like these reform movements because of the division they were causing between the conventual lifestyle and the observant lifestyle. Those who are following mitigations and privileges and so forth felt accused by those who said the rule is livable. Because the reason why they were receiving the mitigations and the reason why they were receiving all these privileges is because they were saying, well, the rule that Francis wrote is no longer livable. And now they're looking at the observant saying, yes, it is livable. It can be done. And so they felt accused by them, and so they decided to begin to persecute the observants. The observants claimed a right to live the rule. They reclaimed the right to receive novices and any other religious who chose to transfer it to them. And they had a right to their own independent superior, someone who would protect and guard them. So there was a constitution, supplicantibus. Oh my goodness, I can't pronounce things today. supplicationiBus. Personarum, September 12th, 1415. And this is written by the Council of Constance. Now, this again, it was so big that the Council of the Church of Constance took this up, and it gave the observants what they were asking for. So, a Council of the Church gave the observants their own vicar general. The conventual minister general would only have the right of visitation, where the superior, or what's known as the vicar general of the observants, who's underneath the general, but covers these guys, where the general covers the conventuals, the vicar general covered the observants. The vicar general could visit them, but the vicar general had control. So it was one family, one head, but essentially split. Other reform movements sprang up independent of the observants and remained under the conventuals. They did not want to break from the community despite the efforts of the observants. So in 1406, we have Saint Colette Courbet, who received permission to renew the Franciscan order in France and to receive both the men's. She reformed both the Poor Clares and the friars. But she didn't want to separate from the conventuals. In Burgundy in France, many friars joined her reform. And they had their own set of constitutions and autonomy without breaking from the conventuals. In 1448, Pope Nicholas V declared them independent of the observants and encouraged their spreading to the Netherlands. So Colette Courbet didn't want to come under the observants. Now, Bernardine of Siena tried to make them come under the observants. Bernardine met with Colette and told her that she had to accept this new reform. And she said, no, my reform is actually better and stricter than yours. And so she held her guns. Now let me back up and say this. And I think I have to give this a little bit of a part here. So you have Bernardine of Siena, who's now in charge. He becomes the vicar general of the reform movements, right? So his desire is to bring all these reform movements together under one set of constitutions that even the conventuals perhaps would embrace. He's trying to create this set of constitutions. When he brings it to Colette Courbet, she says, these are very nice, but my reform is stricter. I'm not going to mitigate for that. Bernardine was trying to mitigate here and there to try to bring everybody onto the same page and work with these different groups to create one observant reform. And Colette said, no, mine is stricter. Plus, I'm going to send it to the general himself, except not have a vicar general. So no. Bernardine said, well, you're going to have to accept it no matter what. So she had the sisters pray for 3 days, go around the convent on their hands and knees in penance. And at the end of the 3 days, our Lord appeared to St. Bernardine of Siena and told them to leave Colette alone. Okay? So her reform continued on and kept its position underneath the conventual general. Now, Angelo Clareno's group, the Clarini, we mentioned them already. By the 15th century, they were rid of heresy. So in 1473, Angelo Clareno's group from 100 years earlier, more than that, from 160 years earlier, they were purified of heresy, and they were brought under the Observant Reform, the Clarini. For all these years, they have been living the radical Franciscan life and so forth, but outside the order as a separate group. But now they're brought back into the order and part of their observance. However, 13 years later, they were put out into episcopal jurisdiction because of old spiritual tendencies. So although they brought them back in, the spiritualist stuff started to kick up again, and the order said, no, we're not going back there. You guys can leave. Thank you so much for the past 13 years, but now you can go be underneath a bishop's jurisdiction because we're not going back that direction, which was probably a good move on their part. So the ideals of the observants. The idea was to keep the rule in accordance with papal definitions. Spiritual's influence was unavoidable. It was still there, but unavoidable. They kept papal permissions that were strictest and most in keeping with the mind of St. Francis. Others they rejected. Okay? They were accepting of the papal definition so long it was in the mind of St. Francis. Those that weren't, they pushed aside. So then with regards to poverty, they were very strict in regards to accepting money, very strict upon buildings, clothing, and travel. Poor, few, and necessary was the ideal that they clung to. They lived in hermitage friaries, remote and at times wild places. Small groups, no more than 12, in order to cultivate community, to practice prayer, to practice poverty, which were fundamental, particularly prayer, fundamental to the life. A great emphasis was placed on silence and quiet and trying to enter into prayer, very much the way St. Francis established the Portiuncula as a place of prayer. They reacted against monastic customs and kept their own Franciscan customs. They liked itinerant preaching, going about, with a companion friar preaching in different parishes and different towns. And they had a great mistrust of study. Just enough study for ordination, nothing more, nothing less. Okay? So in the next class, I'm going to end here because I want to make sure we have enough time in the next class to really focus on the separation, the final leading to the separation of the order. But I just want to express a couple of things. First of all, we see how the church and the order went through these great struggles after the demise of the spirituals. We had the controversy with Pope John the 22nd about the poverty of Christ and his reaction to the friars, and really the establishment of the conventual life where the Pope said, you own your property, you have your stuff, that's it, basta così. And then you had the Black Death, and then you had the 100 Years' War, and then all the controversy with the popes, all this other stuff. And so, it kind of broke the connection to the spiritual connection to Joachimism, that old thought. And the order emerged out of it with a solid form of living the life according to the conventual observance. But then also sprung forth from that was a new spirit of reform. A new spirit of reform that was free of Joachimism, that really went to a certain peacefulness about how to live the life. And again, Blessed Paul of Trinci really led the charge on this, really the father of the Observant Reform. And it created this form of life that enthused people to say, you know what, I do want to go back to the way Francis lived. And he had this resurgence of the life of Francis according to the Testament, the life of Francis, and the words of Francis. And so beautiful that you had this resurgence of the order. Now, unfortunately, Bernardine of Siena was not able to keep it all together. He did his best to try to, he and John Capistrano did their best to write constitutions that would hold all these reform groups together, and maintain the same and similar constitutions. We'll talk more about this in the next class. But what we have problematic here is the fact that you have all these reform groups that sprung up independently of each other, now trying to be brought together under one headship, with one constitutions and guiding them to living the rule, to create this one branch of the order that would be observant of the rule, so it wasn't all in this dysfunction of various ways of living. They wanted kind of a uniformity to the reform movement. Now, as good as this was, and great of an ideal as it was, it differs from the Capuchin Reform, because the Capuchin Reform really began as one group that exploded, which we'll see when we do Capuchin history. In this particular situation, we have the various groups trying to be brought together into one, and this we'll see doesn't work. Not only does it not hold them together, but as time goes on, they begin to weaken out. As good as the constitutions were written by Bernard of Siena, John Capistrano, and so forth, the constitutions aren't strong enough to hold the friars to the feet to the fire, to living out the rule of Francis according to the Testament, and eventually they start falling into mitigations and relaxations, and in the end they wind up just like the Conventuals, almost just like the Conventuals. A little more poor, a little more austere, a little less monastic, but run into the same difficulties, same problems. Now, we should also mention, too, here that when we talk about reform movements in the 13th century, the 14th century, 15th century, even the 16th century, we can't compare it to reform movements today. The Conventuals of the first centuries of the order, the first beginnings of the order, was certainly far more observant and radical than today's present-age religious. People will look at the Observants, we'll look at the Conventuals back then of the 14th century and say, gee, they're pretty radical. In comparison to even our modern-day reform movements, the Conventuals would be far more radical than present-day reform movements. And so when we're talking about these reform movements of the Observants and also the Capuchins or the Zacolanti, we're talking about a reform movement that's pretty radical and strong. It wasn't just a matter of returning to orthodoxy to the church, which we see today, or just a returning to the common religious life practices, which we need today. They were talking about radically embracing the rule as written by St. Francis. The Conventuals back then themselves were good religious. They were faithful to the church and the magisterium, and they were accepting of papal definitions and relaxations and mitigations, which the church had a right to give. And so it wasn't a matter of simply trying to be faithful to the church and on dogma and morals and being somewhat more religious than others who were reforming. And so it's a little bit different than today's reform, which I can probably explain later in later classes. But I want to get the feel that the Conventuals were good religious. They were living a good religious life. They wore the habit all the time. They prayed the 8 hours of the divine office. It had great pomp in the liturgy. They had the daily mass and so forth. They were faithful to the church and orthodox and so forth. But they just were not living the poverty and the simplicity and the radicality of the original rule. And that's what Observants were about, to go back to the rule and so forth. So we'll see more of that as time goes on. So I just put that out there. The next class we're going to cover the years from basically about 1430 until 1517, the official split of the order into two branches of the Observants and the Conventuals. And then we'll begin our class on Capuchin Reform. And I may jump in there, throw some other stuff in. We'll see before we start Capuchin Reform, but you can get the gist of it. All right? We'll see you all next time. Thank you.